Hello everyone, welcome back to the 10 days of JavaScript. Here we are in day number 9, and in this lesson we are going to learn about 5 or 6 different topics that are all important, but maybe each one didn't deserve its own standalone dedicated lesson. Okay, now without further ado, let's jump into the first topic, and that is anonymous functions. So what in the world is an anonymous function? Well, throughout this course, usually when we create a function, we give it a name, right? So we would say function and then my cool function, parentheses, curly brackets. Well, as the name suggests, an anonymous function would simply be if we got rid of the name, right? So if we just had this. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, what is the point of this? If it doesn't have a name, how can we ever call or execute it later on in our code? Well, let me show you an example of when we could use an anonymous function. So let's erase this and let's give ourselves a goal. Let's imagine that we want to set things up so that whenever the user clicks anywhere on the web page, so anywhere down here, whenever they click, we want to show an annoying alert pop-up message that says, "Thank you for clicking." Now we've already done this in an earlier lesson, but this time I want to show you how we can use an anonymous function. So because we are speaking JavaScript in the web browser environment, we have access to the document object, and we can look inside it and call the add event listener method. And then remember, we give this method 2 arguments. The first is the event that we want to look out for, in this case, click. And then the second argument is a function that this method will call at the appropriate time. Now, up until this point in the course, we've always included the name of a function here, and then maybe created that function with the matching name down here. And that's a great approach if you think there's even a 1% chance that you would ever need to call or use that function somewhere else in your code besides just this line. But what if we're pretty darn confident that this is the only place where we would need to use the function? Well, in that case, we can actually just include an anonymous function right here for the second argument. Or in other words, instead of just the name of a function here, we can actually include the recipe for the function itself. So check this out. We can get rid of B and say function, parentheses, curly brackets, and we could even drop down in between the curly brackets like normal. And remember, our goal was to create an alert pop-up message. So alert, and have it say, "Thank you for clicking." Okay, now if I come down to the preview part of the web page and click anywhere in here, awesome. We can see that that function successfully executed. Now again, because this is an anonymous function, it has no name, so we have no way of referencing it or calling it anywhere else in our code. But that's not a bad thing if we don't need to call it anywhere else. Okay, now let's change gears. We've seen anonymous functions in a nutshell. Now the next topic I want to talk about in this lesson is arrow functions. So what in the world is an arrow function? An arrow function is a special type of function that uses an alternate syntax, or we could say a cleaner or more minimalistic syntax. And it also has a few other key differences from a traditional function like this. But first, let's start with the syntax of an arrow function. So check this out. It's very easy to convert this traditional function into an arrow function. We begin by removing the word function, but keeping the parentheses right after it. So literally, let's just get rid of the word function here. Okay, now in between the parentheses and the curly brackets, we include an arrow symbol, which is really just an equal sign and then a greater than sign smushed together. And that's all we need to do. So congratulations, you just created your first arrow function. We can test it out. If we come down to the preview area and click, awesome. Now, believe it or not, but we can actually make the syntax for an arrow function even cleaner or even more minimalistic. So let's do this. Inside the curly brackets for our function, let's not jump down to a new line like we usually do. So I want to place my cursor right at the beginning of alert and just hit backspace a few times. And then down at the beginning of this line, we can backspace to put it all up on a single line. And now with an arrow function, if the body of your function sits on a single line, we actually do not need the curly brackets surrounding the body. So we can get rid of this opening curly bracket here and get rid of the closing curly bracket right here. And if we test out our code and click down here, we see that it works just the same. So an arrow function really lets our code be a bit cleaner. Now, before we move on to the next topic, there are two more features of the arrow function that I want to show to you. The first feature is that when the body of our function sits on a single line like this, the arrow function is automatically going to return whatever we include here. Now, in this case, we don't need to return the alert message. But in the case where you do want to return a value, this can save us even further typing and let our code be even more minimalistic. Let me show you what I mean. So let's get rid of this example. And let's imagine we have an array. Let's call it my numbers. And let's just set the array to hold a few values like 10, 500, and 2000. Okay, now let's imagine we want to use the map method to create a brand new array where each item from this array has been doubled. So we could create a new variable to store the new array. We could call it doubled numbers and set it to equal the original array, my numbers, and then call the map method. And now practice makes perfect, so let's do this. Within these parentheses, let's first include an anonymous function that's just a traditional function, and then we can practice converting it into an arrow function. So for an anonymous function, I would spell out the word function, and then parentheses, curly brackets. We know that each time the map method calls our function, it's going to pass into it whichever item from the array it is looped to. So within our function parentheses, we want to include a parameter to work with the current item. And then in the body of our function, we would just return that number or that parameter times 2 to double it. So now let's test this out. Let's log out to the console, our new array. So console.log doubled numbers. And if we check the console, cool. We see that the numbers from the original array were successfully doubled. Now let's make it our goal to turn this into an arrow function. So first we just get rid of the word function, but we keep the parentheses with our parameter. Then in between the parentheses and the curly brackets, we include an arrow symbol, which is just equal sign and then greater than. Okay, and then let's adjust it so that the body of the function sits on the same line. Backspace here and backspace down here. If it sits on a single line, we don't need the curly brackets. Also, if it sits on a single line, we do not need to include the word return here. Return is just sort of implied in this sense, so we can actually get rid of that. And another tip to clean up our code, we do not need the parentheses around our parameter if it's just one single parameter. We only need the parentheses if we have 0 parameters, or if we had multiple parameters. If you just have one though, we can actually get rid of these surrounding parentheses like this. Now at first, this syntax looks really weird because it's not what we've practiced throughout the course. However, as we can see, it has the potential to really clean up our code. Instead of having a separate function down here with the word function and a function name and parentheses and curly brackets and the word return, we literally just have these few characters. Cool. Now there's just one more feature of the arrow function that I want to show you before we move on to the next topic in the lesson. And you do not need to type this out with me. You can just watch. So I'm going to delete what we have here and actually just paste in my clipboard. And this example should look familiar from our previous lesson. Remember, this is the code we had when we were learning about context and the this keyword. And right now, I want us to focus on this inner function. Because remember, in this context, the this keyword is pointing towards the global object, instead of the John object. And this behavior of JavaScript can be confusing, it can seem unintuitive, but that's just the way it is. When we call a function that doesn't belong to an object, or I should say when we call a function that isn't a method, JavaScript considers the object that is calling or executing that function to be the environment's global object. So that's just review. We learned that in the previous lesson. Now the question is, what if within this function we really wanted the this keyword to point towards John? Well, we have a few different options. We could use the call method that we learned about in our previous lesson, but remember the topic at hand right now is arrow functions. So the final feature of arrow functions that I want to talk about is that they do not have their own new this keyword. So if for whatever reason we really wanted to break our code up into an inner function like this, and we really wanted the this keyword to still point towards the John object, we could just use an arrow function. So I'm going to get rid of this entire function declaration right here. I'm going to keep the call to the function, but I will get rid of the function declaration, and we instead could create a variable, call it I'm a function, not a method, and set that variable to equal an arrow function. And just as a test, I will log out to the console, the this keyword inside of this function. Okay, and we're still calling it just like a regular old function, but if I check the console, right above John Doe is driving a car, we see that the this keyword is pointing towards our John object instead of the global object. Awesome. The reason this happens is because arrow functions do not have their own new this keyword the way that a regular traditional function does. And arrow functions use the same variable lookup strategy that we learned about in the previous lesson with scope. So JavaScript's going to say, okay, does the this keyword exist within this current local scope or within the body of this function? No, it doesn't. So I'm going to look one level up or one level outside of this, which would be the block for our drive car method, right? And we know that inside that, like where the cursor is right now, we know that the this keyword does exist, and it's pointing towards exactly what we would expect it to point towards, the John object. So long story short, I know that was a bit of a ramble, but this can be a really confusing topic, so I wanted to go over it in slow motion. Long story short, a simpler way of wording this is that arrow functions do not change the value of the this keyword. Whatever the this keyword was pointing towards in your current context, that's still what it's going to be pointing towards even inside of your function. And this makes arrow functions a really nice tool to have up our sleeve. Okay, so that's arrow functions in a nutshell. Now let's move on to the next topic in this lesson, which is function hoisting. Let me delete all of this code. And what in the world is function hoisting? Well, let me show you an example.